raped, forced to bear his children, liberating one of the most...
Actually, by a kidnapper.
Not Elizabeth Smart, no, there was another case where it was her actual father.
Okay,
but we can just still imagine situations in which this horrible kind of torture occurs for someone's entire life. This went on for over 20 years. It seems that the Christian doctrine on suffering with these kind of examples says something like, while that's really bad, she will be accepted into heaven and that'll make up for it. Do you as a human being feel that you can apply the same kind of logic? That is, if this person was, say, your neighbor, and you knew that she was being held in captivity, would you feel comfortable saying, well, I know I can easily report this to the police, but I know that she'll be accepted into heaven, so I'm just going to let God take care of that one?
No, because we have a mandate as Christians to speak up for the abused and for the oppressed, and to do what we can to help. Christians and all people know that there are limits to how much of the evil of the world they can stop. And Christians, of course, take a step that non-Christians are not willing to take, and that is to believe that what we are unable to stop, God is permitting for a purpose that He alone understands. Now, that sounds like a cop-out, but it's quite consistent with our worldview. Our worldview is that we are all very highly ignorant creatures compared to the God who made us, and that we are not really aware of His plan, except insofar as He reveals it, and that He has revealed much of it, but much of it He has not. And suffering to us, we can see it only on the plane of the immediate. And if God does permit suffering and does choose to reward people, let's say martyrs, in another life for their sacrifice, well, we have to, Christians, it's worth it. God's not a poor economist. He would not make us pay such a price if the reward was not worth the price that was paid. Even though some of these people are paying the price unwillingly. We don't know how God will handle all those cases, but I will say that it reminds me of a couple of years ago, my teenage son broke his arm. He was in a skateboarding accident, broke his arm, and it was an ugly matter, and it took a while for the emergency room to get around to him, as is so often the case. By the time they got to him, his arm had to be re-broken. And they asked my permission. The doctor said, do you mind if I re-break your son's arm? Well, he was in enough pain already. I didn't want to inflict more pain. I wanted to say, no way, don't break my son's arm. You fix it, fix it without breaking it. But I actually asked my son, how do you feel about it? He said, go for it. So I said, yeah, okay, you can break his arm. Now, I think sometimes, suppose my son had been 3 years old instead of 17, and I had to make the same decision. There's no way he could have understood the wisdom. Why is my dad letting this horrible pain be inflicted upon me while he stands by and doesn't stop it? Well, I know why I'm doing it, because I don't want him to grow up crooked. I want him to be fixed. But I happen to know that he's broken in a certain way that can't be fixed without further pain. And I believe that in God's economy, all suffering is intended by God to be at least potentially therapeutic in the eternal sense. Not all people get the benefit from it because they don't respond to it in a proper way. But I have suffered a few pains in my life too. And I wonder why. Why did I have to go through this particular pain? But it's never crossed my mind that God could have a better purpose than I could imagine for me to go through it. And the hardest things I've been through, I've been tortured and raped for years and so forth, but the hardest things I've been through have been excruciating at the time. And I can say, looking back, not only in eternity, but even now, I'm a more mature person. I've gained from it. But I'm not saying everyone gains from it. I'm saying that God wants suffering to be potentially therapeutic. It doesn't always turn out that way because of human responses too. Sorry, I can't do better than that. Too little time. Thank you. Question?
I mean, the analogy breaks down, right? A couple of analogies break down. The analogy where we've gone through trials and tribulations and we're going to be better because of it. We feel like we're stronger because of it. That's not the kind of suffering that brings up the problem. The kind of suffering is where you go through a horrific battle with cancer and then you die. Or you're, like I said, with a small child, burned to death over 80% of his body, suffers for a while, and then dies. Where there's no clear benefit to it at all. That's the kind of suffering.
No benefit visible to us.
Yeah, visible to us. Now, so what about this idea that, well, maybe there's some good that comes of it. The philosophers have a name for this, called the parent analogy. It's exactly the kind of analogy that you made. But again, the analogy completely breaks down. Because in your situation, the only way you could bring about your son's arm being straightened in the proper way was to inflict this pain upon him by breaking it again. But let's not forget, God is omnipotent. He can do anything. He doesn't have to break arms to straighten them out. He doesn't have to inoculate us. If he wants us to not suffer, he can bring that about simply by willing it. So the analogy breaks down because unlike with God, we're limited in our abilities, and the only way you can do some things that will bring about greater good down the road is by inflicting some suffering, like inoculating a child or breaking the arm. But that's not God's problem. God doesn't have that problem because he can bring about whatever end he wants by simply willing it.
I disagree, but I can't answer. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I do have a question for both. I'll start with this. Dr. Ramsey, just a clarification on atheism. Because there tends to be different degrees of atheism as well as with theism, I came across the definition that atheist is one that not only disbelieves in the existence of God, but believes that there's proof against the existence of God. To be fair, I'm just wondering if that's the viewpoint that you take, and also, if so, what do you believe the strongest evidence against God?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems that you're right that there's different sorts of mechanisms of support for either theism or atheism. So you might, for example, simply be an atheist because you believe there's absolutely no good reasons for theism and leave it at that. You don't think that perhaps there are these really strong, compelling arguments against theism. You just don't think there's any real support for theism. I think most atheists actually adopt both views. They don't think that the arguments in favor of theism are very compelling, and on top of that, using what I discussed earlier, kind of the inference of the best explanation, there are some features of the world that are embarrassing to the theists, that don't really make sense within a theistic framework. In other words, let's take the suffering that exists in the world, that's evidence against the existence of a benevolent, loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. So I think actually most atheists sort of go both ways. The arguments in favor of God aren't any good, and moreover, there's some compelling reasons for actually believing God doesn't exist. Can I just say one more point on this? Because another thing that often comes up is the distinction between atheism and agnosticism. And I thought that maybe that's where you were going with this. I just wanted to touch on that because I think there's been a fair bit of confusion on that topic as well. A lot of times agnosticism will be defined as anybody who thinks that maybe God exists but they're not sure. Or maybe they think that God doesn't exist but there's some doubt there. Okay, well I actually think that if you think that God exists but you're not 100%, then you're just a theist who has some doubts. And if you think that God doesn't exist but you believe you might be wrong, it's possible that you can be mistaken, then you're an atheist who just realizes that like a lot of the other things you believe, you could be wrong. My view is that agnostics are really right in the middle. You know, here's 100% certainty that God exists, here's 100% certainty that God does not exist. There are some people who really could just go either way. They're right in the middle. They just don't know what to believe. And I think that's actually the proper way to think of agnosticism. I think it's actually a very rare view. I mean, here's the test to determine whether or not you're an agnostic. Suppose that we ask you, do you believe that God exists or not? Give us your answer, and in 5 minutes we're going to find out if you're right or wrong, and if you're wrong, we're going to kill you. Okay, so you're in that situation. If your response is, flip a coin, I don't care, then you're an agnostic.